I would like to discuss something that we haven't really talked about in the right wing or the third wing, and something that I find that is very relevant to what we do, how we continue as a movement, and that is activism. So, for a quick introduction, I came to this conclusion largely through the works of Mickiewicz. So, for example, in his book Pantadeusz, which has a scene depicted on the right, it describes within even the first book itself something that Pantadeusz notices, or rather one of the elders notices about the young people present, the young nobles. And he notes this as Francuszczyzna, so the Frenchness. People wanted Frenchness. And I think that it's a poignant point to point this out, that a lot of philosophical and cultural change has in fact stemmed from France specifically. And a lot of what we can see happening intellectually even is stemming from France, the US, England, and partially from Germany. And quickly before we continue as well, I would like you to subscribe to the Right Cast, other lads such as Sutler's Lament, Renaissance Man, etc. So, firstly, we need to understand how man understands the world, or rather this quasi-psychological conception of man's understanding of the world. Man is narrative-based, and that means that man is not fact-based, but his facts, the things he knows, support the narratives. Man is convinced by contrasting these narratives. You can't convince a man by contrasting facts. You need to contrast the narratives. But there's several ways a narrative can be undermined, which is deconstruction, for example, something the left uses constantly. It can also mean that narratives are inferior, so their intimate truths are somehow inadequate compared to other truths, or they're unrelatable to the person themselves. They cannot be dissonant as well, so basically if you find a narrative and you start pointing out endless contradictions or perceived contradictions, the person will abandon the narrative eventually because it's just not sustainable. But the narratives, most importantly, must maintain some kind of consistent framing of the world. This is where the intimate truths come in. And if there's no intimate truths, it cannot frame the world in any way. And most importantly, narratives must explain the world. So types of narratives. You have political, social, community, personal, artistic, and spiritual, and all of these answer a different kind of question. For example, a social question, a narrative, social narrative, orients you within society. It is, who am I in society? What is my role in society? For a personal, it's even asking something as basic as, who am I? And these are the narratives we have to navigate. We have to be aware of and navigate as we produce propaganda, as we offer something to society. Because currently we are in a very intellectual rut, and it's not an actual rut where our intellect is somehow inferior to the lefts or something. It's that we remain merely in the intellectual, and we fail to actually engage with the regular person. But there's something else in man, and that is caution. Caution is something that we are by design. We are cautionary. We will not trust narratives unless we are confident in the products of the narrative. So we have to observe people. And a narrative is convincing the moment you can observe a person and see the products of the narrative. And that itself will be convincing to you, rather than generally what is said. And the perfect examples are LGBT and veganism. Veganism, for example, meanwhile, it's based on complete lies. There's not a grain of truth in it, much like LGBT. But because they're so happy and they project this endless happiness, regardless of the internal misery they're feeling, to other people, they look at this and they say, man, that's a great narrative. I like this narrative, and people get sucked into it. And even if you don't get sucked into it, it becomes very difficult to actually say that this narrative is convincingly bad to yourself. There's something somewhat mildly attractive about this act they put on. And there's something else that needs to be done in the narrative that begets this caution from us, and that is this prediction of good and evil. Thus, you must be you must be confident in the superiority to others, as the intimate truths are more basically they relate to you the best, and they offer you the best explanatory power. So, what is an intimate truth? Before we move forward, I need to explain this, but they're generally experiential truths. So these are truths that are gained through experience, and they aren't necessarily at all rational. And the reason is because an intimate truth pertains to intimate groups. It is something that closed groups can share because they have these set of experiences that are similar between each other, and that means that they can essentially understand each other better. And at the same time, these are narrative pillars. So basically, we have an set of intimate truths that serve as the pillars for a narrative for a group that shares these intimate truths, and it brings them together and gives them a collective narrative that they can use to essentially distinguish what happens in the world and what is the world. But this does not mean that intimate truths can be wrong or straight up false, but that they're at their most basic they seem somewhat irrational, and they cannot be changed unless they are contrasted or experience dictates that you must change your intimate truth. So for example, I was a runner for a long time, and I remain a runner today. But it cannot be explained because it literally escapes words. The moment I step out and I begin to run, especially if I have some music playing, sometimes there's this drive to run until your lungs can't take it anymore, until you're spitting blood, or if you're racing someone, to be that faster. It's an unexplainable truth, the pleasure of running, for those that haven't experienced it. However, when I'm with a group of runners, or if someone else is a runner and begins to explain what is attractive about running, then I will pick up on this intimate truth through context cues, through inflections of the voice, etc., because I know this pleasure by experiencing it. It is similar to experiencing, for example, the love of God or other such experiences. It is indescribable, it escapes our language, and it is for this reason that I claim that this is a somewhat quasi-irrational truth, because it's impossible to actually rationally explain or make the case for these truths. They can also be related to being, and this is something we really need to remember. And this is why, for example, when we were talking about political concepts of black and white, Afro-American, etc., these are truths that cannot be explained. However, black or white, while being an artificial political concept, there's something else we can explain that's much easier for people to grasp, and that's being Polish, German, Nigerian, American, Afro-American. So these are essentially intimate truths that are reserved for experiences of being that kind of being. It does not mean that they're necessarily contrary to reality or not contrary, but it means that these narratives form because of these experiences, as a result of these facts of being. If you have a certain color of skin or a certain origin, etc., your nature is somehow different to people of a different origin. And it's not only your language, the way you were raised, etc., but there's something in your actual being that is different, that causes you to experience reality differently and form a different intimate truth related to your being of that kind. And a very good way to realize or notice this is how Malcolm X described black being and modern BLM views black being. So modern BLM views black being in a very political sense. It is basically the give me dat kind of view of being, whereas Malcolm X actually viewed blacks, Afro-Americans, as being essentially their own separate nation, and he was driving to their own kind of sovereignty through their own accomplishments. So how do narratives spread? It's very important to realize that narratives have many vectors of spreading. One of these vectors is expression. So essentially you have to have some kind of contact through this raw expression of narrative, and narrative is expressed in many ways, from haircuts to fashion to the kind of language you use, art, media, and there's a whole plethora of ways that it is expressed, and it's the most direct way that we have contact with a narrative. And there is also something that we can call the book cover effect that I will cover later. There's another way you can do it, and that's contact and contrast. Essentially, this relates mostly to being, but several other narratives as well. You can travel to a certain place, and this is something that older historians and philosophers noted when travel was still a difficult task, and oftentimes you were risking your life going to, say, the deepest parts of India or Africa to record these things or to talk to the locals and natives. What ended up happening is they would describe that these impossible to essentially square or agree upon narrative differences between the peoples there and their home narrative. They also found that some questions they were asking were even present in the thought process of the most primitive of say India, whereas at home they were completely not present, whereas vice versa, another such thing was true. And this is basically, you need to actually go out there and talk to these people. You won't be able to contrast your narrative otherwise. There's also another way that narratives spread, but this is only for people who are actually searching for a different narrative. So it's debate or discussion, and we all know how that goes. But what is most effective? And this is something that I think we are completely unaware of. I'll be making a video on what I'm going to call the expression revolution, or the resurrection of expression, and discussing the Hanfu phenomenon in China. I recommend you actually look it up a little, but it's very interesting, and I will be discussing my strategy later, and it's almost identical. But expression. People don't actually tend to understand ideas or ideologies, and I think this is very important because people live by the intimate truths and use a narrative's most basic tools to express the narrative and to navigate the world. Expression is a general emotional level thing, and few, if any, will actually feel a need to debate or interact intellectually with what is considered the evil side, because remember, a narrative also helps us distinguish good and evil. Most narratives will carry a feeling of superiority because of this. Most narratives carry a feeling of being correct as well, so there's really no reason for you to interact with something that is, by some method, inferior. And generally, when we talk about people, they will rely on their elite, the chosen elite, the people who have decided by nature, by themselves, to become this elite and to argue apologetics. And it's the reason why you'll see a bunch of essentially leftist elitists kind of, their elite being so posh and walking around, but it's also a mistake that they have, that they all think they're at that level or that smart to run apologetics, and most of their apologetics is complete trash anyway. But what is most interesting is that few have the ability to actually contact and contrast. Most liberals have experienced the world through basically what is a hotel room window. And very few have the time to commit to actually formalizing understanding their position, which is a very important thing we need to know. People need to go to work, people need to take care of their families, etc. And oftentimes these two take up so much time and energy, there is no time to actually understand your own position. You kind of have an emotional position, you have these intimate truths, you navigate the world, this is what I believe in, but when someone presses you on why, and this is why deconstruction is so effective, they press you on why and you have no idea how to answer. And it's really your first investigation, so if they can lead you through the process of asking why and putting this deconstructive measures into effect, your whole narrative will fall apart and you will have the seeds of doubt sown in your mind. But there is something else in man, and that is this innate intuitive drive toward truth. And this isn't only about the evidence used to support your view. It also has to do with moral truths, etc., things that your evidence won't be able to directly inform you upon. But there is something that happens here, and that is the desire to be right, or the desire for something, can often cloud the instinct. And this means that even though a truth may be contrary to what you believe, because you want to be right, or because you have a desire for this thing to be moral, for example, LGBT, for the perversions to be moral, they will completely ignore the instinct and the drive for truth. But oftentimes we hear, of course, what about debates? What about debates, man? Well, there's a simple issue. And these are in fact the realm where the elite clash, and this is where they refine their arguments and narratives. But the truth is that hardly, if ever, is anything settled in a debate. The participants certainly do not change their views, but neither does the audience. They come into the debate to cheer for their side, for an entertainment. They kind of want to see someone getting pwned, someone getting rocked and knocked out, but they're not there to be convinced. So presidential debates, and this is something that we also have to realize, that when you get to a debate, you're achieving certain different goals than prior to the debate or even your campaign. Debates are generally similarly useless because they're a type of debate. They're a show of power, and they solidify and build the moral of your side while denying building morale, the morale to the other side. Results aren't changed really in general. That's why you often see entrance polls and exit polls are very similar. And whenever you see a change, it's not a big growth of one person. Rather, it's a drop of the opposition. And it's because if you demoralize the other side, They don't want to go to the polls, and this is what we're seeing with Biden right now. There's a lot of damage control being run, go vote, and these really silly stories going around that you need to go in because of these random reasons, because you definitely believe these things, and you need to go because you believe these things. But there is also something that people consider oftentimes, and accelerationists are the people who will oftentimes discuss this, and that's violence. But violence, as demonstrated in my video in To Act, it's a type of anti-action. It's not a type of pro-action. And anti-action is meant to deny the opposition an opportunity to manifest or exist in the public space. This is not restricted to physical violence, which is generally an illegal form of violence. But we have two types of violence that are perfectly legal that is oftentimes used by the left. For example, psychological violence, such as it's basically a type of mobbing, or it's a type of gaslighting, for example. It's undermining the psyche of your opponent. And that's, for example, these ideas of toxic masculinity or mobbing, which is where basically they go in and they stalk you kind of, and they shame you for what you're doing. They're like, oh, you suck, how can you have these beliefs? And you have this dogpile that occurs, and it's not a big amount of people that do this. It only takes a few people. And through this demonstration of strength, more people go into the mob side, the people that are mobbing you. And they will also slander you. But there's another thing that's completely legal, and that's economic terrorism. And that is firing people, denying them banks, payments, etc. It's trying to put them, them and their family under the bridge. It's quite literally using the modern economic system, which is a dependence economy, grabbing you and saying, oh, you got to be employed to live, don't you? Do you not want to be employed anymore? It'd be a shame if something happened to that employment of yours. And people generally shut up because you'd lose everything at that point. And there is this other type that we all love and know by now. It's physical. It's the riots, targeted crime, murders, attempted murders. Antifa does it all the time, etc. They go completely scot-free. Who cares if they're a terrorist organization? No one does anything about it until, vigilantes start shooting people. And all but one of these are legal. It's very important to remember these. As far as narrative goes, it's completely ineffective in spreading narrative, but it's effective in preventing the spread of opposing narratives. It's not the goal to convince, but it doesn't affect the attractiveness of your narrative in general. People aren't going to look at you and be like, oh, he spreads violence. Honestly, the people will forget about the violence in a month or two. And it is a way to establish absolute narrative dominance, because people are just going to be straight up afraid. Hey, Antifa, and you can't tell me this is anything. Basically, they're faceless. There's no one you can actually, tag and say, oh, look, they're leftists. Antifa is this kind of almost abstract thing that, floats around the world and, hurts people. But from complex to simple. I have several models. These are all completely hypothetical. They're very poorly formulated. But we are trying to form a basis, something basic for us to express. But most importantly, I think, is the planes of experience model that we need to understand the best. Deconstruction is a very good strategy itself. So first, we need to discuss what is the base, what are we actually trying to shift and achieve, and who are we targeting when we're talking about narrative. So the base is any sort of political base. It's your amalgamation of people that are either sympathetic to you or that, that support you directly. And you have a hard, soft, and potential base. The hard base is the hard-line supporters. They are inundated, they believe in your intimate truths, they're your activists, they're your representatives. And the soft base is anyone that's sympathetic towards you. They're the people that will vote for you. They absolutely can support you and turn into a hard base, potentially, much like you'll see with the left. Much of the left is a hard base. Even center-leftists aren't really much of a soft base. They're an actual hard base. Who are the soft base instead is generally your centrists. Your centrists, some right-wingers, it depends on the issue and the policy. But your potential base is really, these are your potential voters. These are a very small margin of people, really, that are on the fringe. They're the people that are kind of like, oh, I kind of share your values, but I don't really. And they're often non-existent. Their primary function, however, is very strange. And this is the true centrist, I would say. Their primary function is to prevent the opposition's soft base from functioning at all by kind of dragging them in and saying, no, don't go there, don't do it, And they provide this very ample and strange centrist-like critique that stops people from actually committing into a hard base or committing into sympathy and support. But what do we see during elections? And we assume that the moment of running an election campaign, the moment of debates, is the time to actually gather support and form a soft or even hard base. But that's not the case. Base forming, and thus electorate forming, is done almost entirely in all of the years, all of the time leading up to the elections. This is due to the nature of narrative. You cannot actually, and this is why we don't see much change in support during the presidential debates. It's very rare that this actually happens, and there's a reason the polls have been relatively accurate and relatively stable. So, in order to get into narrative more properly, let's go into the planes of experience model. So we have many planes that we can experience life on, and it has to do generally with the types of narratives we have. And to enact change, one must affect multiple planes at once, and your main focus is you're looking at a plane of experience and you're asking yourself, what questions is this plane asking? And you're trying to attack either the answers being proposed by the other side, but you have to have an affirmative stance. If you don't have an affirmative stance, you're not actually proposing something to contrast with. You can at best sow doubt, but you can't actually convince anyone into anything else. Political change is generally a byproduct of shifting societal expression, and it's a necessary shift that occurs in politics as the managerial class risks becoming very out of touch without a strong base that supports them and will essentially affect their desired results. And basically the managerial class needs to juggle this, but the managerial class has the goal of protecting values. They don't represent someone, they represent something, and these are what they force on society. And this is why we see this huge push of values onto society, rather than seeing the elite essentially saying, oh, we represent you and what's good for you. Instead, we see them representing values, which is basically them saying, I believe in this, and you have to believe in this as well, or bad things will happen to you. There's no mention of good. It's just basically, I have been told by my higher-ups that I have a good position in society because I hold these values, and I propagate these values, and I'm good at it. And if you don't accept this, you're a bad person, and bad things will happen to you. And this is contrasted with someone representing someone, which is them representing your interests, your needs, and they say, what do you need and what do you want me to achieve, essentially? What is the goal that I am supposed to achieve to better your stance? And basically, they have a very rigid definition of good, and they strive for that goodness. So what's the point of the model in general? Your idea, and as I said before, affect as many planes of experience as humanly possible, while at the same time putting a focus on attacking or shifting narrative. If enough planes of experience are affected, a person is in contact. This is the point when we know that people are in contact, and this is the point you'll see it being referenced in media. The media will actually start essentially trying to produce counter-narrative propaganda, trying to dull the effect of the contact that's happening, and prevent people from contrasting the narrative with their own. And this leads to a process, especially if the opposition question the narrative, which would be us questioning the narrative. It causes this questioning, leading to people contrasting, and then there's this little piece that I'll be revealing later that causes them to relate and eventually possibly embrace the new narrative. And this does not mean that one will shift the narrative. It does, however, mean that he's beginning to relate to you. Their narrative is becoming undermined in some way. So, ENDE. What is this? ENDE, ENDE. Well, basically, expression will be discussed later, as it is foundational in all this. It's my personal strategy, I think. But what are the ultimate political and economic goals? Well, first we must express our ideas and present how these ideas look. Our physical person is such a product. Then we must unite like-minded individuals into groups and organizations, from friends to colleagues. Dissemination occurs by using all available means of media. It's really straightforward. And it's education, for example. It's education-centered form of communication. You're educating people on things. And it's very important that in this phase, you're forming communications between each other, which leads to a certain type of unity. And create pretends to disseminating mostly artistic, so very narrative-based forms through these media outlets and through these formed communication channels. And what I think is a really great method is deconstruction. So it's basically a method that is meant, you cut straight to the chase. And it has a lot to do with asking why constantly. So it's kind of gaslighting. So, are you sure? Or undermining the opposition's capacity to reason, kind of being like, no, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, etc., etc. But most importantly, you're asking questions concerning the narratives themselves. And I'll have some propaganda at the very end asking, concerning these narratives. But what is the goal? The goal is to induce questioning, contrasting, and most importantly, doubting. That's what this deconstruction is good at. It induces doubt in the opposition. And it induces confusion as well. And, the subject will reflect this as some kind of anxiety. They'll become anxious, they'll become agitated as well. And this can be a doubt of anything, any of the planes of, experience. And it means that when they experience this anxiety, this doubt, something has significantly undermined that narrative. And it requires either they will retreat to the echo chamber to reinforce themselves, but that crack is forever going to be there, and that scar takes a long time to heal. And what is exposure? So you go and you repeatedly show evident contradictions within the narrative. These can be contradictions with reality, or these can be contradictions within the narrative itself and its intimate truths. That would be a devastating contradiction. But we mustn't point out what we think are contradictions, but what are actual factual contradictions and what are true internal contradictions. And it will lead to doubt, but what I mean when I say these internal contradictions, don't use your logic to understand the contradiction. Use their logic and see if there's a contradiction. And if there is, point it out and it will start to crumble. So, ERDPDC. Embrace, represent, defy, pin and deconstruct, dominate, and control. It's more of a little bit of a debate kind of maybe tactic you could think. But in general, what does it have to do? You embrace an idea, you represent them in public, which is, I think, very important. You defy any demands made on you. So you resist mobbing and, norms on language, behavioral norms even. And you pin the opposition in their position as immoral. You basically accuse them of some kind of immorality, something evil. And then you deconstruct them. You don't offer anything from yourself, which is very important. You just pin them, you moral accusation, pin them, and you keep asking questions after that point. You don't let them actually come back at you swinging. If they do come back and you can't avoid the swing, then you block the swing and you go right back to asking questions again. And you have to dominate discussion and demonstrations, whatever's happening, and control the opposition's flow. And that's what I mean when I'm saying this, You block it and you ask the question again. The point is you're on the offensive, constantly on the offensive. There is no more reactionaryism, there's nothing. You're actually pushing society in a certain direction. But we have to also understand what is mobbing. And mobbing, it's a central tactic of the left. It is their entire social dogma of how they deal with you. And you can kind of describe it as bullying, but it's something at a much more significant level than bullying. It's much more malicious. And you're being identified as a weak person or and there's a slow escalation of violence against you until it eventually will become physical. But it's very simple. In the early phases, it's very easy to resist this. And all you have to do is have an internal, very confident pride and tell the opposition to stop, or there will be consequences from you towards them. And if they escalate, then you too must escalate your opposition. Do not show fear, do not feign humility at any point. This is a clash of strength and a fight for your basic dignity. And if the mobber succeeds, he will establish you, your views, and everyone connected with you as the weakling. And others will just simply, due to fear, join them against you. They don't want to be, on that receiving end. And his mob that is slowly forming behind him. And even if they're small, if the bigger opponent just kind of rolls over, they'll be like, oh, he's a gentle giant, let's just, gut him anyway. But the more strength you show, the more people will naturally join you. NAPA. So this is something that I recently came up. I have a blog post on my minds about it. But essentially it has to do with narrative, authority, and propaganda art. So narrative, your narrative. Authority. Authoritative persons via qualifications and social trust express the narrative or part of it. So you can have, gaming influencers be doing this. This is what the left uses when they talk about shove these things into social media. They'll use scientists and stuff like that. The media uses this constantly, especially with the COVID epidemic, where they're essentially saying that you need to be afraid because reasons and because we scientists say so. They don't even back themselves up with data because they don't need data. All they need is a straight up claim. And because they're authoritative, the narrative gets authority. And so propaganda, it's anything that is run, quasi-artistic posters, the same thing with the media, people being in the media, taking things out of context, lying by omission, etc., or, just exposing truth. And then finally you have art. So at this stage, a narrative is solidified, the propaganda has run its course, and there's a receptive base that is ready, there's the soft base that has been formed, from a potential base, you have formed a soft base, and there's now a need to codify this kind of artistic expression, and we're kind of seeing it. We're seeing the resurrection of synthwave, mid-tempo, cyberpunkish kind of music. But I really think that there also needs to be a different kind of music that really directly addresses some of the content of what we're trying to express. So, what's expression as a method of dissemination? So we're returning to this kind of, another very poorly thought out algorithm, TLPEA. So think, learn, present, educate, and act. Think, open to critical thought, educate yourself in critical thought, educate yourself in logic and philosophy. It's not the hardest thing to do. The more you practice it, the quicker you'll get good at it. Learn, so learn the customs about the past, your past. Learn about traditions, what they mean. Learn mythology, prayers, and artistic expressions, etc. You have to be well versed in who you are in order to actually express yourself. And so present. You have to wear the narrative, quite literally sometimes. Let's say your ancestors dressed in a certain way. Now you adapt that to modern standards. You take, let's say, screw it, a toga of some sort, and you're like, okay, how is this practical and how can I apply it to today's life? And then you dress akin to your ancestors. You start grooming yourself some way. You're resurrecting these things and you're giving them a new modern twist. And that's really what happens, because when we look at things that were done in the past, oftentimes the things that were done for a long period of time were done in a high period of culture. They have a certain tone of authenticity to them. And it is this authenticity that really does reflect a transcendental truth. And that is why it can be resurrected today with its own twist. And that is why we'll see it oftentimes repeat throughout history, because in the end, it is who we are. And then after you have this, you go, you educate yourself. You educate people, actually. Whenever someone asks you, why, what is this? What are you wearing? You educate them on the deep history of this fashion, on what it means on this period of history, etc., on what you are doing and why. But don't put it in political terms. This isn't the time to put in political terms, but relate it to narrative. And a lot of this will have, paying homage to my ancestors. I want to be as great as them, this very prideful narrative. And this kind of, lionizing narrative that completely ignores, any of the negatives. And the left will come out and pull out all these negatives. So you have to also be armed in, these counterfacts and essentially basically telling the left, what have you done? And then you act in the end. And this is, you manifest with others, you politicize the self-dress, we are the right wing, we have these mustaches and swords and hats and stuff. And, you're going out there and you're really giving people some kind of representation, And once you have a receptive base of some sorts, you can run pamphlets and, make these pamphlets educational. They don't even have to be specifically political, but just educating people about a period in history, making them proud, disseminating the ways to make these clothes, etc. Why is expression our weapon? We often forget that we are not just groups of people. We are not really well connected. This is something we constantly forget. Because we're well connected to the internet, we somehow assume that we're well connected in the real world, and that's not true. And we forget as well that our goals are way too big and that we can't achieve them alone or even with a small group of committed people. It's just not possible. And the ideas are getting smaller and smaller in scope, but ultimately there is this disconnect and the ideas are too big. And this is a reason why I think the Golden One and Survive the Jive are somewhat successful channels, and men as well, is that they are really fulfilling several important roles on the right. And the first and foremost is advocacy in personal matters, in this personal narrative. And this is something that is completely ignored. In fact, narrative, I think, is completely ignored on the right. It's a concept that I sometimes find is completely non-existent, and it irks me to no end because it really leaves us just in this perpetual intellectual abstract area that no one is able to grasp, and then we're frustrated that everyone's too dumb to understand us. People aren't too dumb. People don't have the time, and that makes us dumb instead. And all of these are just completely ignored, and it's, and the personal plane specifically is one that's hardest to influence. And instead, you're ceding the ground to freaking Jordan Peterson. And so there is a place for self-help advocacy and eventually some kind of group help as well. But there's more to the issue because we are alone. We can't affect, this mass change. We can't change a city of 200,000 people no matter what we do. Even if we manage to get into power, we're one guy. What are we going to do? And we can't especially do this on a legislative level, especially if we have no base. And I think the base is key here, creating a base. But we can affect societal change to create the base in the first place. What we need to remember is that there is a phenomenon, I call it the book cover phenomenon, and that we can use this to our advantage to enact this change. So what is this book cover phenomenon? It's simply a promising phenomenon, I think. Whenever someone changes their outward appearance, be it by social pressure or otherwise, there's a subsequent internal change in thinking, in attitudes, etc. So certain inhibitions become removed and others become solidified. If someone steps into a military uniform, for example, a police uniform, he will change his behavior. He's willing to do things he would otherwise never do. And similar, if someone steps into a short skirt or, put a boy in a dress, he's going to change his behavior and how he understands himself. And it's not only because there's a social connotation, between dress, woman, pants, man. It's not even that simple. It's that there are these subliminal, very specific things that go into making a dress, and for example, something a tuna, toga, or a kilt. And this is the modulating effect of this book cover because it affects the external and affects the internal. And ultimately, what is a book cover? It is that which is meant to be representative of that which is inside the book. And similarly, one who dresses a certain way presents what the contents of the person are. Well, simply through how they portray themselves. And that's similar to what we do every day. And that is why I say, and I have many comments, I've thrown them out there, where we're dissident thinkers, but we never express our dissident thoughts in even the simplest ways. And people say, oh, you're going to get fired in every moment. Are you going to get fired for a freaking haircut? Are you going to get fired for facial hair? Are you going to get fired for, dressing a certain way and going to work a certain way? If you do just for the clothes and there's no uniform, thing going on, then I'm pretty sure you'd have people that aren't even aware that you're right-wing defending you that are pretty liberal in themselves, and they might actually adopt the dress to, in solidarity with you. Surprising as it may be, they'll change because of it. So how does any of this relate? If you can change how people dress and enact change in expression, so you're changing expression by changing how they dress, you can change how they think to some degree. The death of narrative is not an immediate one, so you have to remember this. It's as Ganganovich said, killing an elephant with 1,000 needle pricks. And the point is, his point there was in his book, that it doesn't matter if you're hitting it with a needle prick. Your needle prick might be the one to bring the elephant down, and that's what is important. And as people change their external expression and appearance, they will change their thinking. And it's these little needle pricks. You're changing people, and you're pricking the beast. And if they know the tradition behind something, they too will change their thinking. So because they're looking a certain way, it's not just, this, oh, I look flamboyant. It's this, I'm representing something. And this is, you can see this with the LGBT community. Why do they come dressed in such, why do they dress so abstractly and so, lewdly and so, outwardly sexually? And it's because their sexual perversion is literally their entire life at that point. They are so obsessed with their sexuality that they can't actually live without it. And it's consumed them, essentially. It's the only thing they seem to think about and orientate the world around. And they take it to the extreme, and they basically express it constantly. And, this is why they do it. Because they're representing, and they know they're doing it. And that's why you can see the left will constantly buy LGBT merchandise and stuff like that. Why corporations put up, LGBT, little logos. It's because it's not just a mere expression. It's also an internal thought process that has induced this expression on the outside. So what would you prefer in a type of expression? The man on the left is your classical Polish szlachcic. And of course, this can be modernized, but not necessarily in many ways. Or do you prefer the modern man on the right? Which one do you prefer? Which one speaks tradition to you? Which one of these men is more likely to hold views, to fight, to actually change the world? Who has some, nobility in them? And there is another thing that we need to remember. It's this lone wolf paradigm. So there is a reason right-wing terror is a lone wolf phenomenon, or third-wing terror, any kind of terror from anyone, opposed to the left. And it's because we are lone wolves. We're looking for a pack, and there are other wolves out there looking for a leader as well, or a pack as well. No one can tell who is whom in today's world. Similarly, looking at the previous pictures, if, say, everyone on the right, for example, dressed as the man on the left in the Schlachtiz dress, we'd know who was who immediately like that. But when, you don't know if someone's sympathetic or not because everyone's dressing like the man on the right. We all look the same. Look at Europe. I can show you Krakow, I can show you Warsaw, I can show you, I don't know, Gdynia, Gdańsk, Sopot, Szczecin, Białystok. All of those areas being vast, even Śląsk. I can show you different places. I can show you Vilno, etc. The only thing that's different is the accomplishments of our ancestors. We don't look any different. We are literally the same across all of Europe. And so maybe we have to consider that maybe there is some sort of validity to this idea of whiteness that the left perpetrates, that, they throw at us, and that we have accepted. It's because we have maybe inundated ourselves into the whiteness narrative, into mass culture that is white, so to speak. So we are lone wolves. We are essentially alone, and fundamentally, we don't look any different than anyone else. And I think that's a massive shame. That's something we desperately need to change. But there's something we can do, and that is acting alone. And lone action is the first step towards conquest. You have to express this. I said this in my 2-act video. This is daily activism. This is something you can do every day on your own. It's low risk. Make patches and put them on backpacks or something. Hang up posters. It's okay to be white. I'll have some example posters posted in the comments, in the description, that you can take a look at and maybe give me some feedback. But there's something you have to remember when making these posters or making any kind of propaganda. It's make sure they attack narrative, not that they're asserting something possibly within the leftist narrative. For example, it's okay to be white is not combating the narrative. It's accepting the narrative and trying to make that which is evil in the narrative good. It's not going to work. It's never going to happen. No. And it ultimately buys into this diversity paradigm that they have going. And you have to change how you dress. Make the traditional clothes. Don't be afraid. There's so many sewing channels out there, man. I've been looking through them constantly, and you'll find girls that make their own clothes dress hyper traditionally. It is astonishing. And their thought process also seems to be a lot more traditional as well. Change how you groom. It's easy. No Shave November is around the corner. Make it an excuse. Learn the ethnic martial arts. We have HEMA, we have all of this, but there's also other ethnic martial arts that are being resurrected, locally. Learn dances or whatever, but learn them because this is something that is historical as well, and it's worth it. For example, for me, I gotta learn Kazachok. There's apparently something called Bojowy Chopak, but that's only in Ukraine. There's also Sambo, but that's only in Russia, so I'm kind of screwed with all of that. So instead, I'm gonna have to learn something that's a little bit more, maybe let's say, local. There's something called Savbor. I don't really have much faith in it, unfortunately. But for example, I can learn the cross-cutting art and use it for, stick. It's something I can definitely do. It's something I can use the internet for. I can find another person that's also interested in this, maybe even in my local community. We can go out and practice every day, every evening or something, and make it part of our physical recreation. Learn your ethnic history. Learn from your origins to the point you are today. Make a narrative out of it and keep to it. Learn ethnic languages and writing. For example, my goal is to ultimately, within 10 years, speak at least half of the Slavic languages out there fluently. Because I speak Polish, it won't be too hard for me to learn the Western Slavic languages, in terms of grammar, etc. And even the Eastern Slavic or the Southern Slavic. The issue is, the writing, etc. There are some differences in grammar. But ultimately, it is much easier for me. And it means I can begin to communicate with people of my ethnicity across a much wider area. And Slavs, we're privileged because we control such a huge area by our physical presence. But also, it really increases your intellect and it makes you a lot more, fancy. It's the easiest thing to learn when you have a language that's similar to yours. For example, English, learn German. Germans learn English, or Germans especially learn, something like Dutch or Scandinavian languages because it's a very close family. And if you learn the writing, for example, you can learn runic writing, and that is impressive in itself. And my ultimate goal is to learn Old Church Slavonic and Boguslav because it is, I can read then original texts from who knows how long ago. And what is a great thing you can also do? Anonymous educational pamphlets for passerbys. And this is what I said. Make these pamphlets about a certain period in time, a certain style of dress, and, start lionizing it. Really start, cranking it up. And people are going to get interested in this alone, and especially the young people are going to get interested in this, teenagers and stuff, because, it's new, it's interesting, and it's something about them, and they're still discovering themselves in the world. It's going to give them something to reference as well. And you can just leave these boxes out, in places. No one has to know you left it there, and just disappear. Make sure cameras don't catch you, because you might get caught for littering. And we have beautiful cultures, but this is another concept that's very important. But they're dead cultures, and a dead culture is simply a culture that's not expressed in any active capacity. It's expressed maybe for one day, a year, or something like that. But you can't go into your local city, into your local village, and see this culture alive and thriving. These products that are specific for the region, etc. It's not something that happens. And so we see ourselves in a sort of schizophrenia because our animus isn't expressed as this culture. And so essentially, it's this kind of, do I support the mass culture? But what is my culture? But, there's this mass culture. Maybe I should support it. That's normal, right? And it induces this schizophrenia. And these people become, this is why also the leftists are violent, because they see you expressing something authentic and they'll laugh at you and they'll scold you, but not because you're different, because you're authentic, because you're true, and that hurts them. That's something the left does a lot, is they project a huge amount. That's all of their accusations are quite literally projection. And it's because they see you and they see you being a good person, and they see what they could be. And you're the reflection of the good against their reflection. And they're looking back at themselves and they're like, I'm evil and he's good. And so they, they kind of try to translate this, I'm good and you're completely evil, you hate you, etc. And, it's evident in their actions, but it's not evident always in their words. But let's look at this. Look at these pictures. Maybe it's a time to bring culture back. And I know the right side not necessarily is the truest, Highlander, Kilton, etc., but it's just an example. On the left, it's not necessarily the truest version of what we want today. Because, no one wants to necessarily dress in these very flamboyant ways, but maybe we can make this kind of minimalist. Maybe we can bring it back and express the animus, the spirit of our people in a way that doesn't stand out too much from what we have built in this generation. This is another example, and I believe, I'm not certain, I think this is Greek traditional dress. This might, of course, be just theatrical, and it's not necessarily practical for every day, but who says you need to be able to do everything every day? Who says you need to be able to do a backflip every day? That's nonsensical. So, then what? What about politics? You've forgotten about politics, you've talked about expression. What about politics? But this is political. So what tends to happen is this kind of brute forcing of the public, where a certain narrative that is being actively expressed will see a surge, or it will remain a considerable niche. But this is a considerable niche. This isn't something, where like 20 people in the city. I'm talking about maybe, several thousand people. Wherever you go, you keep seeing it. You're exposed to it constantly. And the result will be the public being forced to express an alternative narrative that is being expressed. This, if it becomes ubiquitous enough, will force most people to come into contact with the narrative. We saw this when women were convinced to smoke by Barnes. So a massive campaign was run in order to convince women to smoke. It worked. It was brute forcing the narrative. And pair this with many tenets of feminism, and it can be argued that much of women's recent liberation can be tracked to one massive corporately driven social shift and experiment. This was the combination of expression with narrative, and it worked and changed society. And we see this with LGBT movements as well, is what we see this drive of expression. And, the point is to be able to go into public and not be ashamed of what you are and what you are wearing. And, the moment you do this and you go into public and you receive no pushback, you're going to start taking another step and another step. And slowly but surely, your movement becomes a political movement. It becomes a political statement in and of itself. And that's what LGBT has done and will continue to do, and that is how they keep winning. And do you see this? They produce products that are LGBT focused, and they make money off of it. They support each other for being LGBT because they can recognize who is who and what is what. Think about the lesbian haircut that became popular, and lesbians only wore it to identify each other. This is a ubiquitous method. But then again, politics. So, when we look into politics, shifts in these managerial class antics will coincide with public opinion. They generally do, as their goal is to remain the managers for as long as possible, because this is their, high social position. This is their power position. This is where they gain money, prestige, everything. But they're meant to express corporate values ultimately. Their upper people are the corporate managers, and then so on and so on. But the managerial class is subject to corporate will. And they don't express what is good for the people. And this means that there's going to be an inevitable clash. So, how do we get into politics now that we know how to build a base? Getting into politics means, well, we generally have the best formulated strategy that I largely agree with is the right cast, the enclave strategy. The strategy is one of taking over local government and then setting up a precedent for other legislative changes. However, it is, I think, still too large of a scale. And I would argue that the first step is organizational activism. I think it makes our entry step way too far forward. So, you have to know organizational formations. Well, of course, we need hierarchy. We're either reactionaries, we're traditionalists, we are right wing, we are third wing, we're third position, whatever. We believe in hierarchy and it needs to be there. If you don't want to be subverted, you need hierarchy. It needs to be intimate. So all members must know each other, must incorporate each other into each other's lives in some marginal way, even if it is just meeting at organizational meetings, organizational parties, etc. It needs to be translucent. So it can't consider itself this weird elite. This is something that we have an issue with in Poland, where Młodzież Wszechpolska, Obóz Narodowy Radykalny, Ruch Narodowy, all of them think themselves almost as if this too elite. You need to sacrifice your whole life, to function in these organizations, and that's just too much. People can't do that, and that really cuts out a lot of what you can do, because you're losing all of this potential activism. You're saying, no, you must commit your life to the organization, and everything. The organization is life, and life is organization. It makes no sense. And it mingles and helps organize daily activists. The point is, these people engage with the common man constantly as these kind of leaders, as these mentors. They provide documents, ideas, tested solutions, and even manage the finances necessary to make certain events happen. So, say someone's trying to run an event, these guys will reach out to them and they'll say, we'll help you run this event, And really, tying things together and getting things moving and pumping. But you need strong vetting and commitment as well. So, in the organization itself, these people are the ones that are committing to the movement. So this is the head of the organization, really, and are willing to sacrifice time for it. They can even treat this potentially as a job in some cases, and this is what we see in the left, and it creates very strong organizations in the end, these NGOs, and they are able to do a lot. But they mingle with the everyday activists. They make sure that you know how to, in your everyday life, resist. And that's a lot of what feminism did, and that's a lot of what LGBT did. Basically, they said, do this, do this, do this. People did it, and they didn't get even shamed for it. And then it just escalated from there. And, it really flooded out. And there's another thing that needs to happen. It cannot be anti-family and anti-life. Basically, not everyone can be this, hyper-committed person. All people need a life of some basic. And because we are a reactionary movement, people need to have families. No organization can be too consuming. A man's life is not merely the fight, it is also the family and the family table. As the head of a family, you need to be able to go home, to have a family, and this will also keep your morale up. You can't tell people to just do things. Eventually they'll get burnt out by it. and your turnover will be huge, and things will change, and you'll never spin off the ground. Another thing we want to remember, it's my principle of localism. I know Settler has discussed this, but I've had localism in my vocabulary for a long time, and I've sort of defined it in my third wing entire mini video series that I'm going to be making. And the tenets of localism are local elections. First and foremost, you think locally. You don't think, local victory is global victory, so you need to win something. You need to win a beachhead before you can move to anything. So you need to become elected to any kind of official position in public life. So they can be minor positions, they can even be major positions, but they must be a position in the first place. The position must wield some kind of executive power. This is very important. So you can be president of a small town, or the police chief, or even the head professor of a university. These are all very important positions. They're all positions with power. And you don't need to have a huge swath of people below you. I'd say start from very local elections. I'd say even start from your classroom if you're young enough, you have elections in the class. Really start there. If you can become president of a class and really start, throwing out some quasi-policies, getting people involved, you've got experience, you've got some power, you can then move on in life and, get elected to an actual position as an adult. And then there's the climbing the ladder. So you climb the ladder and stack local government with your trusted people. It's something that happens all the time. Let's not pretend that this is some kind of dishonesty, being partisan or something. Do it. This is a system we exist in. We need to fight according to its rules. And it ensures, most importantly, that you have this beachhead, you have this forward operating base that you can actually, advance deeper into the workings of power. And the goal is to secure an entire region eventually. And essentially, once you're at a certain point, you can really start, screwing with, little leftist beachheads, and then, kicking people out and making sure, diverting money, resources from other regions to make sure you start winning at a very strategic level. And once you have an entire region, man, you're in a very good position. And what does hammer and anvil mean? You must now put pressure on society. So go after leftist organizations and begin to enact policy locally that changes the fabric of society and how it functions. This then conforms to the enclave strategy. So this is the point when we're at the enclave strategy. You have finally secured the region. You're finally putting, the hammer down. And this combined with the expression strategies will induce a hammer and anvil effect, because you have a strong base at the bottom, which is pushing up, and then you have power at the top, which is pushing down, and you're crushing the managerial class and this rebellious class of people. These anarchists, essentially, that want anarcho-tyranny. And these privileged kids that, that just want, communism, want everything to be given to them. And they're the ones that are going to be caught in this vice. And that's what's very dangerous to them. That's why they keep stopping us from expressing ourselves even in the most basic way. What is the takeaway? Narrative is malleable. Don't think that it is something that is set in stone to the end of your life. You're going to believe this the same thing. People change their narrative all the time. I was a diehard communist in high school. I became, this weird centrist, and then very quickly I shifted as I moved to Poland, and I was forced into, some rural work, some physical labor, etc. I moved way into the right, and today I'm in the third wing of something, my own little project that is possibly even more radical. It's my own little vision. And it changed. My narrative changed. It was a consequence of me being taken away from, this constant shame and constant pressure of the leftist narrative, and letting my own being contact and contrast, etc. I had doubt put in, and then that doubt, caused me to relate and shift. And, it kept happening over and over again until I'm where I am now. And instead of, thinking of shifting further, I'm really just using my reason to rationalize a new narrative into being. So we have to remember, narratives compete. It's not reason that competes. I doubt any of you, or maybe some of you, because, most of us on the internet are generally, we think of ourselves as intellectuals. But when looking at the common person, look at a protest. What's actually clashing? It's not, an exchange of reason. It's not a debate. Neither side wants a debate, really. Either side wants to just beat the other side to submission. And it's these narratives competing, not reason. And expression is the way to build the base. This is something I'm going to beat into my channels, just it's going to be everywhere. Expression is the way to build the base. Once you have a base, you can move to something, you can achieve a goal, but you need the base. You need some sympathy in society. You need to be able to show people that, say, my narrative produces this, and then they look at this and they're like, I want this. This is good stuff. This is authentic. I like it, you know? And they'll actually commit to what you're saying. They'll actually maybe start investigating, you know, they'll start accepting certain elements. And once they accept certain elements, a lot of other things have to change. They're already changing. But all of this must necessarily lead to political power by taking over the smallest governments first and then climbing the ladder. Literally a village. Become the leader of a village, then run for a region or something, you know? But you have to climb the ladder. If you cannot climb the ladder, if you cannot even take the first position, there's no point in you jumping for a regional election. You don't have the base, you don't have the power for it. And after that, once you have the region, we can continue with the enclave strategy, which is a great strategy. I completely agree with its basic ideas. But I think it's still too far ahead. We need to really focus on the baby steps that seem to have been completely ignored. And a lot of this has been about formalizing activism. You know, what can you do? It has some explanatory stuff in it, you know, where you ought to go in concerning politics, etc. The enclave strategy is something I generally deeply sympathize with, and it's also something that can work in many countries around the world. It can work in Poland even. But before we can even get to such a level, there is something we need to do, and that is building a base, as well as fighting this culture war that is pertinent and it's prudent to do so. There's also an arena to gain experience prior to taking up governmental positions, and this is it. After that, you know, after accomplishing this, we can, you know, build up to the enclave strategy. And that is the ultimate goal of all of this, taking the principles of localism from the kitchen to the streets and eventually into governmental seats. And if you're interested in something more, these are going to be linked in the description. I have some propaganda examples. I threw these up literally 10 minutes. That's all it took. I used Krita, whatever, however you pronounce it, and I threw these two graphics up. And it's something that attacks the narrative of whiteness in general. And I'm also going to throw up a snippet of my political book. It's something I've been working on for a long time, and it's going to continue to get expanded. It's a never-ending project in some ways, but eventually I have to publish it in some way or another. But this is a snippet of my political book. You know, it's kind of a compilation of some blog posts and other private writings that I've never posted. But be warned, I'm not the biggest of brains. That's my humility, I guess, speaking. Maybe I am big-brained, I don't know, but I don't want to think I'm big-brained because I don't want to, you know, become prideful in some way. You gotta keep growing in some way, be humble. But if you have the time to waste, and feel like wasting it, feel free to read it. Maybe something will interest you, maybe you'll have a takeaway, maybe you'll have some new arguments to run with. Who knows? But that has been me. Sława, szczęść Boże. I've been Boguslav, and have a great day.